does persecution mean in Christianity? Persecution is an act of harassing, oppressing, or killing people because they are different. Christians are persecuted because their belief in Jesus Christ as a Savior does not conform to the sinful culture around them. The Bible records persecution of God's people both in the Old and New Testament, and Jesus warned his followers that they would face persecution. Today, we'll hear real stories from students about the persecution of their grandparents.
My grandpa has experienced the persecution when he was taken away to an orphanage because his parents were Christian. His siblings got taken away too. He was only 5 when this happened. It was really hard for him to learn and be around people and he had extra work to do.
My grandmother experienced persecution as a child. She was an excellent student and teachers would constantly lower her grades. When she grew up, she was as a minor and she was constantly called to the director's office to lower her salary, and they wanted to get her away from God. They lowered her salary by 75%.
Rudolph is my great-grandpa. He got persecuted because he was Christian, and he also got beaten up and hit with a stick and got bullied because he was a Christian, and the teachers lowered his grades.
So my great-great-grandmother was Olga Cornelia. So Olga's parents had a lot of land back then, and Russia wanted to take it. So they had a list of names, and they took everyone except my great-grandmother and grandfather. My great-great-grandfather was taken to a concentration camp, and he died there a week later in a gas chamber. Olga and her daughter were taken to a different concentration camp, but there was like little bread per person. It was very cold, negative 30 degrees every day. So Olga helped her children survive by making sweaters like this. If she needed more like food for her family, then she would trade her clothes for more bread and food to feed her family. 3 years later, they got their release letter, so my great-grandmother walked all the way there to get it, and then they had to find someone to read it because they couldn't read it, even though my great-great-grandmother had the whole Bible memorized. So after that, they were the only ones out of the whole camp to be released, and my great-grandmother would tell people who experience persecution, even though you're persecuted for Christ, we still can't lose faith in Jesus Christ.
Vala Babic, she lived in Dalishich, Bratska Oblast. She was a devout Christian. She raised her children to be Christians, and the government was upset because of that. And the leadership gathered the village for a commerce court to take away the parental rights of my grandma and grandpa. And the leadership said that the children were neglected and not cared for. But the villagers knew the Bobbin family well and knew that they were fed, taken care of, and their house was clean, and they were an example to others. And the villagers said that the government should be worried for other children's safety because their parents are alcoholics. This is how God saved my grandma's life. The advice that my grandma gave to people who have persecution is to trust God even when it's hard, and to ask God to strengthen your faith, and that He will give you the wisdom to say what is right.
My grandma got persecuted when she was in school. They gave her really bad grades and her friends. They didn't let her go to college.
Tell us about your grandparents who experienced persecution.
The army tried to force my grandpa Peter to swear an oath to kill for his nation, but he said no, and the general sent him to a mental institute for 2 weeks. The doctor there said he could make fake paperwork to make him look unstable, and he did that. And Peter was sent out of the mental institute and was put in the army for 2.5 years, but he did not swear an oath.
My grandpa Peter, as a child, he was persecuted a lot, and in school his teacher tried to put a red star on his jacket that symbolized communism, but he did not let her, and the teacher purposely lowered his grades and was rude to him. Because of that, he did not get to go to college, and he didn't get a really good education.
The government wanted to jail my great-grandma Nina because she was teaching her kids in biblical teaching. This happened after God miraculously healed her broken leg. Her son Michael went to school and returned his communist ticket saying, "I want to serve God who healed my mom's broken leg." And so the government was even madder, took my great-grandma into prison. And while the court proceedings, they were talking about what they should do to her. And while the people outside were protesting, the people in the church were fasting and praying. And so after that happened, they let her out, and God let her out and helped her, and they dismissed her out of the court case.
When my grandma, when she was 13 years old, people asked her to come to the communists, and she refused, and they wanted to hit her with a chair because she was a Christian.
My grandma got persecuted by getting fined and having church services.
My grandpa, his commanders told him that because he was Christian and he did not take the oath, they could put him to jail for up to 7 years. But by the grace of God, they didn't put him in jail.
The government persecuted him at work.
My grandma was Galena, treated badly, and at school even though she got everything correct, they got treated badly.
My grandfather was persecuted. Even though he was a good student and did well in school, his teachers constantly lowered down his grades because of his faith in God. When he graduated, and on his diploma, he was under the influence of religion, and that prevented him from being in higher education and college.
When my grandpa Peter had church service, the police would often find out through church service, and they would tell my grandpa that he would go to jail in Siberia. My dad and his brothers and sisters were always made fun of in school and also called bad names.
When my grandpa was listening to radio, the police came and took away the Bible and said, "If you gather for prayer, then we will cut the power off." My grandparents experienced persecution when they gathered up in church services. The government police would raid the place and take away their cars and fine them 50 rubles per person and drive them 20 miles away so that they could never come there again. My great-grandfather was in prison for being a Christian.
What is something that God did in the life of your grandparents?
Was they read the Bible in this room. After they finished, they would leave the room, and people would come in to try to persecute them because they knew that they were Christian. But they'd never find the Bible and no evidence.
My great-grandfather's name was Maxim Todorashko. One miracle that happened in his life was when he was sent to a prison camp in Siberia for 4 years. At the place where he was staying, there was a very violent man that asked him for his allowance money. After my great-grandfather refused, he attacked him. Able to escape, he slipped under the bunks and ran outside. He asked for God's protection and help even though it was negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He ran to a small utility house and started knocking on the door. Inside was a Christian brother who could help him. However, this was happening in the middle of the night. The brother was afraid to open the door. My great-grandfather was outside for almost 2 hours. In the morning, the Christian brother inside opened the door and could not believe his eyes. He thanked God that he did not freeze to death in such extreme weather.
When Anatoly married my grandma, after a few years, my grandma repented. She prayed 20 years, and once my grandpa started going to church. He attended church services regularly, and once at the end of a church service, he went to the front of the church and gave his heart to the Lord.
My grandpa, Alexei Adamovich Mamuchuk, was born in Lutsk, Ukraine. A miracle that happened in his life was when he was in Academy of Finance. There was a question on a test. Is there a God, yes or no? He answered, yes, there is a God, since he was a Christian. Later on in his life, when he went into the army, since they looked at his test, they threw him into prison and into a black hole, which there was hardly any light, and there was hardly any food given. One time when my grandpa was feeling that his teeth were hurting, he prayed to God so that he would send him an onion. Later, in a few days, he asked God, and God answered his prayer for the onion. He was very thankful to God that he let someone send him an onion.
When God saved my grandfather when he drowned into the lake, and his brother also helped him too.
Then and now, how schools were better before.
There were better morals and discipline. Kids were more respectful, and teachers would make sure that everyone followed directions.
If the teachers would find any disrespect with the students, they wouldn't tolerate it, and they would smack them with a stick.
When you walked to school, you exercised. And the other thing was that there was no internet, so kids played outside more. Kids were respectful to older people.
So there were quiet, free streets to play with her family. The food was better because it was from your own garden.
They played more outside games in childhood.
There was no cell phones, so the kids would go outside and play. Before the internet, kids were more active outside and spend more time outside.
My grandma's childhood was better because she had her own vegetables, her own vineyard, and other animals and garden animals.
Then and now, what is better in your childhood today?
Is that there's more technology to help teachers and students learn. You drive to school when it's cold weather and you have warm clothes. And now we have talented chefs who make delicious food, and we have better education now.
Everything is easier now than like making food and hot water.
Because we have technologies, we could communicate easier.
Now they live in America, so they can practice their faith freely.
Now there's cars that people don't need to walk miles just to go to school. Now with technology, kids are more intellectually advanced.
That we have our own hot water and our own cold water.
Today there's more cars and food available for people.